Welcome to the second video in what will hopefully be a more or less weekly series of rainy season gardening here in Zambia. We have continued to not have much in the way of rain, but what rain we have had has already started to have quite an impact. Certain various things are flowering, various things are growing, good and bad. And yeah, I will talk through some of the reasoning more in this video. Last video was a bit of a rush, just trying to get something done. This was supposed to actually go up on Monday, but I didn't get a great deal of sleep because a cobra had come in, and I decided, as much as every time I set myself a deadline, I then drop it. I think knowing that I take my life into my hands every time I walk into the kitchen is probably a fair enough reason to be a little bit behind on a few things. So yeah, so welcome to week 2. Go. So first up, cleaning out the chicken house. Fairly basic task. The dust coming out is not sebum, that is actually diatomaceous earth, which we put on the lowest level of it, just to try and help discourage mites. I have no idea if it's actually worked. It's something my father picked up. At the same time, we also put a lot of lemongrass in there, which, whether or not it discourages the mites, it does help with the smell, and they have had less mites since we've been doing that. But that might also have been because I'd been sick for a while, so I hadn't been cleaning them out very fast, which is when they got a lot of mites. Now, the hens that I've just ejected are actually broody on nothing. One of them was on eggs, but is now being broody on a rubber egg instead of her actual egg. So that's not trying to force nest abandonment there. I'm just trying to get soap in every part, just to make sure any other mites that are still breeding in there are killed. Soap is actually very effective at killing a shocking amount of invertebrates, so I wouldn't generally recommend slopping it around on your vegetables, but in a chicken house where you don't really want a thriving ecosystem, it can be a useful thing. You'll notice the chicken house is quite high off the ground. Partially this was my father's plan for his back, but also it is hoped to discourage too many cobras from going in there, well, snakes more generally, but it's not always been effective. Yeah, so just scrubbing it all down, and then I actually managed to lose a bit of video here, which I think we're about to see. Yeah, so then putting in the diatomaceous earth once it's dried out, then lemongrass, then bamboo leaves, which seems to be a lot less smelly than when you use things like shredded paper for their bedding, and also they ate a lot of the shredded paper, so I was not overly comfortable with that. Whereas the bamboo leaves, if you take them out, you pop them around a tree, it's not nearly so unsightly as shredded paper. Do fill them in quite deep, because these chickens, when they nest outside of here, very often burrow. Also taken out the ramps, because the chicks that we have are now much too big to actually need them. They fly quite well now, so they don't need any help getting in and out of their nest boxes or the house itself. The next thing was planting the Thorn of Christ that I had cut last week. Keen-eyed viewers may notice a certain trend here in the things I've planted. I tend to plant a lot of straight lines. Part of that is the particular field where most of that is happening. I am trying to divide up into a series of much smaller, almost allotment-sized spaces, using hedges, and the plants I'm using for these hedges will be more varied as time goes by. Initially, I am planting the things that can easily be moved if they end up being too dense, which is why, as you can see, I'm planting them very densely. This is in the hope of excluding a lot of the grass, so they become more visible and less likely to be cut down either by a slasher, a scythe, or a tractor later in the season, depending on who gets around to cutting fastest. Generally speaking, I would say hedges are the most transferable part of European gardening, should we say, to any situation. I think they are just about the best thing you can add if you are going to be planting any sort of row crop. One of the reasons I am very fond of the Euphobias for this, despite the considerable pain that Thorn of Christ inflicts on me as I'm planting it, is that they are very toxic. So very few things that eat our crops can also eat Euphorbias. This is very useful when they are distributing, because many of the more rapidly reproducing pests are not very conscious of what they're eating, shall we say. So, for example, aphids can often sample plants as they move through them to see if they're food or not, and a good toxic plant will, if it doesn't actively kill them, will certainly slow them down on moving to other areas of an edible crop. Hedges also are great for just stopping soil being washed away when we have large storms. They're also very good for keeping moisture in the soil. Trees are better, but sometimes there is a limit to how much shade you want from above. And generally speaking, if you plant a hedge, even if it's of a single species, over time it will become much more diverse. I will, once these are more established, start planting fruit trees into these hedges, which will then become emergent trees from the top, and also some taller hedge species, just to create a more three-dimensional barrier in case we end up getting some livestock that needs to be contained, or at least kept off vegetables. Another major reason that I like to plant hedges is because of their environmental impact, basically on the wider system. So in addition to being a barrier to both livestock and pests, they create a living space for a very wide range of species. That they're very similar in many ways to natural thickets, which are usually the richest environment in any environment they occur in. That they tend to have a combination of species of both closed canopy woodlands and open grasslands. Will both find thickets quite suitable for their needs. Hedges create a living space for a very wide range of species, many of which are beneficial. So as you get a greater diversity of plants establishing within a planted hedgerow, you get a great diversity of pollinators using that, which can then spread out onto your crop as well. You also find a lot of predatory insects favour thickets for when they are sheltering from their own predators, and having that permanent vegetation means that they are right next to your crop. So if you have a period when you've cleared your crop, you've still got the populations of your beneficials living in your hedgerow ready to spread back into your next crop. So yeah, I think hedgerows are just about the best thing since well before sliced bread, frankly. These are seedlings of a Brazilian cherry, which is a type of myrtle with a delicious edible berry, which is native, as the name might suggest, to South America. It is a really unusual tasting fruit, but a major reason that I like to plant them is because they make a very good hedge. They are like acid soils and sandy, well-drained soils, which really suits us. They do not do well drying out when they are small seedlings, but once they're mature, they cope with our dry season quite well, provided they're not in full sun. They germinate very readily in the bag method. All you have to do is make sure the seed doesn't dry out going from the fruit to the bag, and you find very quickly they start to germinate. These are actually from last fruiting season, so that was the end of the last rains. As you can see, they have a fairly high germination rate. I think there were probably 3 or 4 ungerminated seeds in there, and they can start to germinate within a few weeks of putting them in. It's quite rapid, as it is with a lot of the forest fruits. I would not recommend planting them in pots of this size for the long term. This is very much just to allow the roots of these plants that have been crowded together to become a little bit more robust individually before I plant them out once the rains begin proper. I don't find they do well in pots generally. They can be very slow to establish even directly in the soil, but in pots they tend to remain very small for a lengthy period, even if they will stay alive quite easily. They can lag when growing out in the soil as well, but they do mature faster that way. This is a pair of Euphorbia turcali, I think it's called. I know it as the pencil tree. It is, to my knowledge, a native Euphorbia. It is very popular in gardens in rural areas of the country without much irrigation. It needs absolutely no care once it's established, and it establishes very easily. I want these two to be more trees than bushes, so I'm basically just chasing them up as cutting everything off below the browse line. Not that they would naturally have a browse line, because this tree is mostly only eaten by a few select insects. Most vertebrates would very much avoid this. I would also say it is probably advisable to wear gloves when pruning this, or else wash your hands very thoroughly just afterwards, because it is much more irritating to the skin than the sap of the thorn of Christ. Now, what I'm doing here is I am cutting side branches off sickle bushes, which are acacias in the genus Dichrostachys, and also a few off a straight-thorned acacia in the genus Facellia. Some people will contest that, I'm sure. And using them to make a barrier in between the guava trees, which the chickens can use for a sense of security as they go up and down eating fallen fruit and insects. You will notice I'm doing this barefoot to begin with, which actually did have quite a good reason, but when I got slightly worse than I had hoped for prickling by standing on a small thorn, I decided that actually I would be better off in shoes, and then I remembered the reason I wasn't wearing shoes to begin with, which is because last time doing these particular bushes, wearing quite thick shoes, I stood on thorn and it drove a piece of the shoe into my foot, which was much more painful in the long term than standing on a thorn in barefoot, which you tend to feel quite quickly and pull off of, has ever been. And sure enough, I did that again quite quickly. But as you can see, they're quite complicated to prune because they tend to tangle into each other. But I want them as trees more than bushes, mostly because trying to move past a sickle bush when it is spreading out and low is very difficult, and we don't have dikers or anything that can use that type of very thorny thicket in any particular way, and I don't particularly want such a dense thicket here. I want to be able to access this personally, even if I don't want chickens and goats to be able to access every part of it in the longer run. So I want these to be trees, whereupon I hope I will be able to start harvesting gum arabic, because as far as I know, Dichrostachys can be used to produce gum arabic, which is very useful as a thickener in a wide range of cooking applications, as well as for drinks. I believe it has some functions. They are, as with most of the acacias, they are nitrogen fixers too. Many of our native trees are, but because acacias have such small leaves, they can really rapidly enrich the soil around them. So having a light canopy of acacias over areas where I want to grow vegetables can be a way of ensuring that I have a regular enrichment of the soil to boost the growth of vegetables. There are a few regional projects, I don't know if they extend beyond Zambia, but certainly within Zambia, to encourage farmers to plant a type of acacia called winter thorn, which should be Euphorbia albida, which is not only to enrich the soil, but also, because of the way they grow, they can be used for a very seasonally appropriate sheltering for the crop, dropping their leaves when you actually need full sun on your crop, and having a light canopy to keep the soil moist and healthy when you don't want the full tropical sun weighing down on your crop. Additionally, the acacias are really good for some of the birds. We have quite a few finches, as well as some of the larger birds like the grey go-away bird, which really prefer to nest in much thornier trees, and many of the birds that don't specifically require thorny trees will also use them, so it's quite a good way of just enriching our biodiversity. We also have a very small grasshopper which actually feeds only on the Facellia that I've seen, and is regionally endemic, so quite pleasing to be providing food to that. Having freed up some bags by planting out the Brazilian cherries, I thought it'd be a good time to try germinating some pigeon peas in a bag, which is something I haven't actually tried doing before. Usually I just plant them out directly, but I just wanted to see what sort of difference I get in establishment rates, and whether I can have a slightly larger plant ready to go in the ground once the rains arrive properly, so they're just a bit bigger by the end of the rains and maybe start producing a bit sooner. The other seeds here are pawpaw seeds, which usually I've grown pawpaws from cutting, but I thought it would be worth trying because one of the ones from cutting had just produced its first pawpaw, and, you know, a little bit of genetic diversity never hurt anyone. Once the pencil trees had healed over, I took the opportunity to plant those. Another hedge, of course. These are not the only things going into this hedge, but I was using large ones here because I'd previously planted out a hedge here, mostly of Thorn of Christ and some pigeon peas, and someone went through it with a slasher last year, once it had established, and it was lost in the grass at that point. So I'm hoping by being slightly larger when they're going in at the beginning of the rains, these will be a little bit more visible. Once the rains are more established, it's very easy to just force them into the ground, but again, with having only had one real storm so far, the ground is still a little bit tougher, so it's best to make a small hole, just use a garden fork and then shove it in there. I do space these more widely then I would space many of the hedging plants I would use, because along this hedge I do intend to plant quite a lot quite soon, and I do find that if these are too dense, then it's very hard to get anything else to grow underneath them. Mostly because even though they don't have leaves all year round, the mass of those branches that they photosynthesize with really does block out a lot of the light. Although it has been a while since the rains came, you can see the soil's still fairly soft here where I'm doing the planting, because it is quite well shaded and it's quite well fed with leaves from multiple types of trees. If you compare that to the soil on bare ground, such as in a traditional vegetable patch just a few meters away, it is much harder to get anything in there at all. Even covering these soils with just grass is better, because as you can see the fork goes in a lot more easily. Again, it's not far away, it is the same soil just with slightly different vegetation. And I believe that should just about be it for the week. So hopefully no more surprises, and I will upload another video next Monday.